All right, good evening and welcome everyone to Secrets of the Bible, Iconic Stories, Mystical Meanings, and Their Lessons for Life. And the key two questions that we have to ask anytime we are exploring a biblical story. And that question number one is, how does this story fit into the purpose of creation? How does the story advance the purpose of creation? And question number two, we have to recognize that every single story of the Torah has an inner story. There's the soul of the story. There's a mystical and cosmic layer underneath the story. What is it? Because when we understand it, we will fully understand the story and we will be able to apply the eternal message to all times and all places and all circumstances of life. Today, we're going to ask these two questions to the story of Yosef and his brothers. As we're going to see, it's quite the troubling story that leads to perhaps dozens of questions, and we're going to divide up the presentation of the biblical text of the story into three parts and to three separate videos. Here is video part number one.
Joseph was 17 years old, shepherding with his brothers in the flocks. And Joseph brought bad word of them to their father. Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons, as he was a child of old age to him, and he made him a striped coat. His brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, and they hated him. And they were not able to speak peaceably with him. Joseph dreamed a dream and told his brothers, "Here we were bundling sheaves in the middle of the field, and here my sheaf arose and also stood upright. And here your sheaves surrounded, and they bowed to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Shall you then reign over us, or will you rule over us?" And they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words. He again dreamed another dream and related it to his brothers, and he said, "Here I have dreamed another dream, and behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing to me." His brothers envied him, but his father guarded the matter.
Things come to a head when, one day, Jacob sends Joseph to check on his brothers, who are out shepherding the flocks in the countryside.
They saw him from afar, and when he had yet to come near to them, they schemed against him to put him to death. And they said to one another, "Here comes the dreamer. Now let us go and kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we will say, 'An evil beast has devoured him,' and we shall see what will become of his dreams."
Reuben, the eldest of the brothers, dissuades the others from committing outright murder, suggesting that, instead, they throw him into one of the pits out there in the wilderness.
When Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped Joseph of his coat, the striped coat that was on him, and they took him and threw him into the pit. They sat down to eat bread, and they lifted their eyes, and they saw, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead. And Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is there if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, but our hand shall not be upon him, as he is our brother, our flesh." His brothers listened, and they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph to Egypt. They took Joseph's coat, and they slaughtered a hairy goat, and they dipped the coat in the blood. They sent the striped coat to their father, and they said, "We found this. Please recognize. Is it your son's coat or not?" He recognized it and said, "My son's coat. An evil beast has devoured him. Torn. Joseph is torn." And he mourned his son many days.
So in part one of the story, We learn of Yaakov showing favoritism to his son Yosef, gives him special attention, gives him a present. Yosef has these dreams that appear to proclaim him leader of his brothers. He shows off. He tells his father negative reports about his brothers. This creates jealousy. This creates hatred. The brothers attempt to kill him, but decide instead to sell him as a slave. Then they deceive their father, showing him the bloody skin of a goat to demonstrate that Yosef has been killed. Anything strike you as puzzling in the story? Are there any questions that pop out from you from the story? Yes, Mitchell.
Well, it always reminds me, how could anybody just be so easily made to want to kill somebody as a group, let alone individuals? And even Reuben didn't want to mean to kill him. It was still part of it. He could have stopped it and just said, forget it. Your ideas are wrong.
Right. Great question. How could these brothers so easily be motivated to kill their own brother? And then when the other brothers get involved to stop the murder, it turns into a sale. Why don't they just say, this is crazy? What are we doing to our brother? Right? Great question. Anyone else have a question? Sam?
Yeah, I have one. Why did Jacob not learn from his childhood that having a favorite son can cause issues?
Are you saying with Yaakov?
Yeah.
Why didn't Yaakov learn from his own experience that it's probably not the best idea to have a favorite son? Right? Mm-hmm. His father favored Esav, his mother favored him. Not a good idea. Again, fabulous questions. With these questions in mind, we go to part 2 of the story, which takes place 22 years later.
The next segment we will read is from Genesis, chapter 45, and it occurs 22 years after the selling of Joseph. In the interim, this is what happened. Joseph was taken to Egypt and sold to Potiphar, a high-ranking officer in Pharaoh's court. Joseph was immensely successful in everything that he did, and he was put in charge of all his master's affairs. Potiphar's wife lusted after the beautiful and charismatic young slave, and she tried to seduce him. When Joseph rejected her advances, Potiphar's wife had him thrown into prison. After many years in prison, Joseph gained his freedom when he successfully interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, which predicted 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. Pharaoh appointed Joseph viceroy of Egypt, and Joseph's successful planning saved the entire region from starvation. The famine also engulfed the land of Israel, and Joseph's brothers came to Egypt to purchase grain. Joseph recognized them, but they did not recognize him. Joseph accused his brothers of being spies. Taking one of the brothers as a hostage, he forced them to bring their youngest brother, Benjamin, to Egypt. At first, Jacob refused to send Benjamin to Egypt, but the famine was in full force, and soon their food ran out. Finally, Judah persuaded Jacob by vowing to assume personal responsibility for Benjamin's safety. When the brothers came to Egypt for the second time, Joseph framed Benjamin by planting his silver goblet in Benjamin's sack. He arrested the brothers and declared that Benjamin will remain in Egypt as his slave. Judah approaches Joseph to plead for Benjamin's release, offering himself as a slave in Benjamin's place. This is what happens next.
Joseph was no longer able to constrain himself, and he called, "Remove every man from my presence." And no man stood with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. He put his voice to weeping, and Egypt heard, and the house of Pharaoh heard. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" His brothers could not answer him, as they were bewildered before him. And Joseph said to his brothers, "And now do not be distressed, and it should not upset you that you sold me here. For as a source of livelihood, God has sent me before you. It is not you who sent me here, but God. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, 'So said your son Joseph, God has placed me master to all of Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay.'"
And that is how Jacob and his 12 sons, who would become the 12 tribes of Israel, ended up in Egypt.
So 22 years after Yosef is sold as a slave to Egypt, he works up the ranks, and he ends up becoming the viceroy of Egypt. He's the second in command. There's a famine in the land of Israel. His brothers are forced to go down to Egypt to purchase food due to the famine. What does Yosef do? He accuses all of his brothers as spies. He imprisons one of them. He questions them about about Binyamin, and ends up taking Shimon as a hostage and makes them bring Binyamin back, right? He's driving them crazy. Ultimately, Binyamin comes down. He plants a goblet in Binyamin's bag, right? Falsely arrests him, right? What's going on here in the story? Any questions? I mean, is there anything that just like jumps out at you when you hear this story? And I can imagine what all of you are thinking right now. There's a tremendous amount of questions, right? It would be impossible to cover them all tonight. So we are going to focus on 2 questions. Question number 1 is, what were the brothers of Yosef thinking? Right? How could we justify the actions of Yosef's brother? Not only do they hate him, they plot to murder him, ultimately sell him as a slave, and then deceive their father. How could they do such a thing? That's question number 1. Question number 2 is, what was Yosef thinking? How do we justify Yosef's behavior? He drives his brothers crazy. Is he torturing them? He's trying to get revenge on them? What is Yosef's motivation? Now let's explore each of these 2 questions a little bit deeper. When it comes to the brothers' motivation, they hate Yosef, they want to kill him. Now, you might think that, what's the big deal? If you look at the biblical track record of brothers getting along with each other, it's not so good. The very first brothers ever, Cain and Abel, Cain and Hevel, what happens? Cain kills Abel, Cain kills Hevel. We have a murder, the very first brothers to ever exist. One kills the other. And then, as we just discussed last week, Esav wants to kill Yaakov. Again, one brother wants to kill another brother. So perhaps it's not that unusual. In the biblical era, sibling rivalries were taken quite seriously, perhaps to another level that we had now. So therefore, Joseph's brothers hated him and they wanted to kill him. But of course, we know that this answer is not going to work at all. Because in the story of Cain and Hevel, Cain is bad, he's wrong, he's evil. In the story of Esav and Yaakov, Esav is wrong, he's bad, he's evil. But that's not how the Torah presents the 10 brothers of Yosef at all. We're going to begin with text number 3, page 107, and I would like to ask our Kohen to lead us off. Andrew Cohen, if you are there, if you could please read text number 3 on page 107.
Before explaining how the story of the selling of Joseph and all that happened with him is the basis for the kingdom of David and Mashiach, we must address the great difficulties with this story. First of all, a most general difficulty. The greatness of the sons of Jacob, the progenitors of the 12 tribes of Israel, is well known. Certainly, they were greater than the supernal angels, and they represent the mystical 12 configurations of the divine name, Havaya. How then could the mind grasp the idea that these exalted individuals would join together to commit the most severe sin of all the sins in the world, namely the sin of murder.
So text number 3 was authored by a great rabbi who's known as the Shalah, after one of the books that he wrote. He was a rabbi in Prague, Germany, and then made his way to the land of Israel, where he passed away in the year 1630. And he's buried in Tveria, right next to the Rambam. So he elaborates on this theme that we have in Jewish tradition, that we cannot look at the 12 tribes as ordinary people just like you and me, who can get into sibling rivalries, sibling fights, and might even be motivated to murder their own sibling. That's not the case. These were tzaddikim, they were righteous people, they were holy, they are more holy and more pure than the angels. And he adds to that, he says the tetragrammaton, the name of God which we do not pronounce, the yud, the hey, and the vav and the hey, it can have 12 different combinations. The 12 different combinations of the letter yud and the hey and the vav and the hey correspond to the 12 tribes. That each of the 12 tribes represent unique channels for divine blessings, for divine flow, for divine influence to come to this world. Being that's the case, there has to be more to the story. There has to be more. We're not just talking about regular people. How could it be that tzaddikim, holy, righteous people, can fight, can hate, can even plot to murder? There's got to be more. Now let's go to question number 2, look at it a little bit more deeply. What was Yosef thinking when he was torturing his siblings? He pretends like he doesn't know them. He pretends like he's never seen them before, and he runs them around like crazy all over the place, right? What's going on? Did he hate them? Was he holding a grudge? Was it all about revenge? The text itself tells us that that cannot be the case, because he overhears them expressing shame and embarrassment for the way that they treated Yosef years and years ago. And this is what they say. This was in the video, it's also in your text. Yosef says, "It's not you who sent me here, but God." He continues, he says, "Do not be distressed, and it should not upset you that you sold me here. For as a source of livelihood, God has sent me before you." This is not a person who has resentment, anger, or ill will. Exactly the opposite. He says, "It wasn't you. I'm not blaming you. God sent me here for a good reason and for a good purpose, so I can save the world and ultimately so I can help you." Right? There's no grudge. So then what's he doing? If he doesn't hate them, if he's not angry, if there's no grudge, why is he lying to them and deceiving them and putting them in jail and planting a goblet in Binyamin's bag and threatening to come in? What's he doing? What's happening? Before we get to the inner dimension of the Torah, the soul of the Torah, the mystical dimension, we'll give a few of the more classic answers to the question. One approach that some of the commentaries go with is that Yaakov and Yosef really provoked all of the jealousy that took place, and the jealousy itself was quite natural. The result of a father favoring a child is going to be jealousy. The result of a child relishing in that favoritism, tattletaling on their brothers, proclaiming dreams that reflect his superiority over the brothers, that is going to lead to jealousy, which can even come to murder. And the Talmud, in fact, says, which is text number 4, based on the story of Yaakov and Yosef, don't do it. A parent should not ever show any type of favoritism, because you know how dangerous it is? The bond, the relationship, the connection between parents and children with each other can be so deep that it even could lead to murder. So Talmud says, don't do it, it's unhealthy, it's not correct. Right? That's one answer. Another approach is, why did the brothers threaten to murder Yosef? It's very simple. Self-defense. They felt if they did not get rid of Yosef, their father was going to get rid of them. It's as simple as that. Text number 6. Phil, would you like to read text number 6 on page 110?
Sure. Okay. When they saw that of all his children, Jacob loved only Joseph, they thought that what will happen to them will be the same as what happened to Ishmael and the children of Keturah vis-a-vis Isaac, and to Esau vis-a-vis Jacob. They believed that for as long as Joseph was alive, they would have no portion in the God of Israel, and their descendants would be excluded from the blessing given to Abraham and Isaac. To be a God to you and to your descendants after you, this belief was confirmed to them by the fact that they saw that until now, only one of the children of each of the patriarchs merited this blessing.
So this is a really great answer, and it's a very logical answer. God entered into a covenant with Abraham. He says, I'm going to have a special relationship with your descendants. They're going to be a light unto the nations. All of the nations of the world will be blessed by you. I'm going to give you the land of Israel. There is a legacy, there's a spiritual legacy that God promises to Abraham, which will carry over through his descendants. Abraham has 2 children. He has a son named Yitzchak and he has a son named Yishmael. Where do these blessings flow to? They go to Yitzchak. Yishmael is gone. But remember, there wasn't only Yishmael. Abraham remarried his Hagar. Her name was changed to Keturah. He had 6 more children. What happened to them? They also were sent away to the east. The spiritual legacy passed from Abraham to Yitzchak, while Yishmael and the other siblings were cut off. Yitzchak has children. He has a son Esav and he has a son Yaakov. To which son does the legacy of Abraham fall to? It falls to Yaakov, and Esav is cut off. Yaakov has children. He has a son named Yosef. There are 11 other brothers, although perhaps more accurately, this should have been divided 10 other brothers, right? But at least in the point in this story, there's Yosef and 11 brothers, and they have a big question. Just as Abraham favored Yitzchak and Yishmael was cut off, Yitzchak favored Yaakov and Esav was cut off, so too Yaakov is going to favor Yosef and we are going to be cut off, right? We are going to be eliminated. Therefore, the brothers in self-defense, they went after Yosef. Again, logical, rational. You could not blame Yishmael for going after Yitzchak, or Yitzchak going after Yishmael. You could not blame Yaakov for going after Esau, right? You wouldn't blame them. Similarly, you cannot blame the brothers going after Yosef. They did it in self-defense. They saw a pattern. They feared that they themselves would be cut off. There's another answer, a third answer, that this all had to do with sovereignty. The brothers had a tradition, which is actually verified quite shortly in the Torah, that Yehuda, the brother Yehuda, is meant to be the leader of all the tribes. King David will descend from him. The Messiah, Mashiach, is going to descend from him. What did Yosef do? Yosef had these dreams. In Yosef's dreams, he was the ruler, he was the leader, he was the king. This absolutely represents treason. This was a threat to the entire future of the Jewish people, to the monarchy of King David, and ultimately Mashiach himself, the very purpose that the world was created. Therefore, this represented treason, and the brothers felt that they had to get rid of Yosef. These are 3 answers that classic commentaries propose. They all work in their own way. They all address the issues that are involved. I don't know about for you, but to me, they're not 100% satisfying, right? After all, once we recognize that all the people involved in the story are tzaddikim, these are righteous, holy people, yet all of these things happen to their life, we know that we have to dig a little bit deeper. We have to get to the soul of the story. We have to get to the inner dimension, the mystical dimension. What does Kabbalah have to say? At the end of the day, that's really the only way to really appreciate and understand any biblical story. So Kabbalah tells us that the root of the conflict between Yosef and his brothers ultimately can be traced back to their parents. Just like all of our problems can be blamed and traced back to our parents, so too the problem of Yosef and the brothers. However, we're going to see we're not just blaming the problem of Yosef and his brothers on the parents. The problem between Yosef and his brothers is essentially a replay of the problem of their parents that have to do with Yaakov and Esav, and that also have to do with Rachel and Leah. So to understand this, we have to get back to the marriage of Yaakov and Rachel, Yaakov and Leah, and this brings us to part 3 of our story and video number 3.
Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. The eyes of Leah were tender, and Rachel was of beautiful form and beautiful appearance. Jacob loved Rachel, and he said, "I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter." Laban said, "Better I give her to you than I give her to another man. Stay with me." Jacob worked for Rachel 7 years, and they were in his eyes as a few days in his love for her. And Jacob said to Laban, "Bring here my wife as my days are fulfilled, and I will come to her." Laban gathered all the people of the place and made a feast. It was in the evening, and he took his daughter Leah and brought her in to him, and he came to her. It was in the morning, and behold, she is Leah. And he said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? Have I not served with you for Rachel? Why have you deceived me?" And Laban said, "It is not so done in our place to give the younger before the firstborn."
Laban, however, agrees to allow Jacob to marry Rachel as well, in exchange for another 7 years of labor.
He came also to Rachel, and he also loved Rachel more than Leah, and he worked with him yet another 7 years.
And that is how Jacob ended up marrying both Leah and Rachel. Leah proceeded to have 4 children, one right after the other: Reuben, Simon, Levi, and Judah, while Rachel remained childless. Determined to participate in the creation of the people of Israel, Rachel asked Jacob to marry her maidservant Bilhah and have children with her. That union produced Dan and Naphtali. Not to be outdone, Leah had Jacob marry her maidservant Zilpah, which produced 2 more children, Gad and Asher. Then Leah had another 3 children of her own, 2 sons and a daughter, Issachar, Zebulun, and Dinah. Finally, Rachel's prayers were answered, and she conceived a child. Joseph was born. 8 years later, Rachel had a second son, but she tragically died in childbirth. The boy was named Benjamin.
So last week, we learned that after Yaakov stole the blessings of his brother Esav, he was forced to flee to Haran, and there he's meant to get married. He meets Rachel, he falls in love with her, he wants to marry her, but he is deceived by his father-in-law Lavan. A switch is made, and he ends up marrying Leah. He loved Rachel, right? That was the girl of his dreams, so to speak, but he's tricked, he's deceived, he marries Leah as well. What happens afterwards? Leah has child after child after child, and Rachel is not giving birth. Rachel even calls out to her husband Yaakov, and he says, if you're not giving me any children, why am I alive? She's almost like it's better to be dead than to be in this relationship without any children. She's pained, she's bothered. Years later, she finally gives birth to Yosef. 8 years later, she gives birth to a second son, to Binyamin, and then she passes away. Understanding this dynamic, we have a better appreciation of what's happening in the family. Why is it that Yaakov loved Yosef so much? Why did he give him attention? Why did he show favoritism? Why was there preferential treatment of Yosef? Why did Yaakov support his dreams? Why later on was Yaakov so supportive of Binyamin? Because Rachel was Yaakov's first love. That's who he wanted to marry. That's who he wanted to be with. But he was forced, he was tricked into marrying Leah. And it's true, Leah produced all these children, but where was his heart? His heart was with Rachel. So when Yosef was born, right, there was preferential treatment, right? Yaakov was excited about his dreams. And then later, he was so protective of Binyamin because Rachel was dead, because Yosef was killed by a wild animal. So at all costs, he wanted to protect Binyamin. And we also can appreciate why Yosef's brothers were so jealous. They're so jealous because here they are, children of Yaakov, right? Their mother, Leah, the wife of Yaakov, and look how they are treated. So this is the family dynamic. But then I asked you the question, what kind of family are we dealing with, right? Is this an episode of the Jerry Springer show, right? He was in love with her, and then he had to marry the other one, and then she had kids, and the other person had kids, and then they started fighting. Like in the next scene, are they going to start throwing chairs at each other? Like we're talking about holy people. We're talking about Yosef. We're talking about Yaakov. We're talking about Rachel. We're talking about righteous people. This is not an episode of the Jerry Springer show. So again, we need to get deeper into the story. We need to understand, why did Yaakov love Rachel so much? Just because she was beautiful? Just because she was so attractive? And we also need to understand, what was Yaakov's issue with Leah? Why was she so marginalized? How come that translated into her children feeling that as well? Right? What's going on beneath the surface? The key to understanding all of the motivations that are going on in all of these stories, in all of these dynamics, is Yaakov taking the place of Esav, Leah taking the place of Rachel. This is all about a sibling switch. The key is a double sibling deception. One brother takes the place of the other brother, Yaakov, Esav. Leah takes the place of Rachel. These two incidences, these two stories, parallel each other in many ways. Let's go through each of them. It happens to be, what I'm going to say now is a text 9, 10, and 11, but we're going to do it orally.
One thing.
Yes, Sam.
I remember reading recently that the word that Asa uses when he says the word for deceived me is the same word that Jacob uses when he's talking to Laban.
There are unbelievable parallels that go throughout this entire story, that being one of them. Right, we're going to focus now on 3. Number 1, firstborn related issues. In the story of Yaakov and Esav, Yaakov manipulates Esav into selling his firstborn rights, and he steals his blessing. Like you may remember the story, Esav comes home from the field, he's starving, he's thirsty, he thinks he's going to expire. Yosef says, sell me your firstborn. So he becomes his firstborn, he steals the blessings. Then we have Lavan to Yaakov. He says it's not so done to give the younger before the firstborn. Lavan's justification for his deception is, hey, we have rules over here. Leah is the firstborn. Therefore, Leah has to get married first. We're not going to do the shtick like you do. Yaakov, you were deceptive and took the firstborn rights. That's not how we play it over here. Leah is the firstborn. So the first parallel is this issue surrounding firstborn rights. The second issue is falsification of identity, right? Identity fraud. Yaakov says to Yitzchak, is this you, my son Esav? What does Yaakov respond? I am. Yaakov presents himself as Esav to Yaakov. What happens with Rachel and Leah? Yaakov calls out Leah, and what does she respond? So what does Yaakov say? Was I not calling you Rachel, and you were answering me? Yaakov is upset. Why is he upset? Because Leah played along with the trick. When Yaakov addressed her as Rachel, Leah responded. So here we see identity fraud. Yaakov claims to be Esav. Leah claims to be Rachel. Next, we have the third parallel. This involves goats. When Yaakov dressed up as Esav, what did he do? The skins of the goat kids she dressed upon his hands. What kind of goat skins did Yaakov wear? Hairy ones, in order that he would feel like Esav. When when Yosef's brothers try to deceive their father and say that Yosef was killed, what do? It says they slaughtered not just a goat, a hairy goat, and dipped it in blood. So we see that the deception that took place between Yaakov and Esav and the deception that took place between Leah and Rachel parallel each other, mirror each other. There's almost a replay of the story between Yaakov and Esav and the story between Yaakov and his wives. Why are these stories connected? Why do these stories parallel each other in such a way? Of course, we have to go deeper into the story. The key is one of the texts that we read earlier, which I'm going to read it for you as soon as I get to it in my book. What does it say? It says, the eyes of Leah were tender, and Rachel was of beautiful form of appearance. The Talmud explains what is the significance that Rachel was so beautiful and that Leah's eyes were tender. Text number 12. This is from the Talmud. Karen, could you please read? Page 117.
Sure. Leah heard people talking. Rebecca has 2 sons and Laban has 2 daughters. The elder will marry the elder and the younger will marry the younger. She would sit at the crossroads and inquire, how does the elder son conduct himself? He is a wicked man, a highway robber. How does the younger son conduct himself? A wholesome man dwelling in tents. So she wept until her eyelashes fell out.
So the Talmud tells us that Yaakov and Rachel were soulmates. Leah and Esav were soulmates. And this is why Leah's eyes were tender. She cried, she was pained, she was hurt to think that she somehow was destined to marry the wicked, evil, the cruel Esav. What actually happens? What actually happens is that just as Yaakov took the blessings of Esav, so too the woman that was destined to marry Esav, the woman that was the soulmate of Esav, Leah, she also ended up marrying Yaakov as well. Now this explains why Yaakov had to marry both sisters. Because Yaakov, not only did he receive his blessing, but he also received the blessing of Esav as well. So therefore, Yaakov married Rachel, his soulmate, and he also married Leah because he received the blessings of Esav. What this shows us is all of these stories are interconnected. The story of Yaakov stealing the blessings is directly related to Lavan tricking Yaakov into marrying Leah. Just as Yaakov, through a trick and deception, received the blessings of Esau, so too Yaakov, through a trick and deception, ended up marrying the woman who was supposed to be the wife of Esau. As we're going to see, this directly led into the conflict and led to between Yosef and his brothers, them attempting to murder him and ultimately selling him as a slave. So we almost already have all of the pieces to the puzzle, but we still need to further develop it and piece it all together to understand the whole story. To understand the next part of the story, we have to go back to an idea that we mentioned in last week's class, that we can't view Yaakov and Esau just as individuals, brothers, the children of parents. Rather, they represent powerful, important spiritual dynamics, spiritual energies, two different ways of relating with the world. Last week, we talked about Yaakov representing Tikkun, and we talked about Esau representing Tohu. Today, we're going to talk about something else. This week, we're going to talk about Yaakov representing the character and personality of a tzaddik, and Esau representing the character and personality of a Baal Tshuva. And we're going to explain each of these terms. Right? What is a tzaddik? How do we identify the personality and the attitude? And really what we mean is the attitude and an approach of a tzaddik towards life. The attitude and approach of a tzaddik towards life is the pursuit of spiritual perfection. That's what the tzaddik is all about. His goal and focus in life is spiritual. The material is not relevant. It doesn't attract the tzaddik, and it doesn't distract the tzaddik because it's simply not relevant. It doesn't play a role. It's cut off and it's shut off. The tzaddik's world is entirely within Torah, mitzvahs, spirituality. Anything else is not relevant and simply plays no role. This is the personality of Yaakov, right? Yaakov, the Torah tells us, was a wholesome person. He was a dweller in tents. The goal of Yaakov's life was to live the life of a tzaddik. That was his attitude. That was his perspective. That was his direction. That was his orientation in life. What about Esau? Esau represents the spiritual power and energy of a Baal Teshuvah. What is a Baal Teshuvah? A Baal Teshuvah means a person who engages with the world, doesn't cut himself off, doesn't shut himself off, doesn't shelter himself. This represents a person who's out there. He's in the business world. He's in the material world. What is the goal behind it? To transform it to spirituality, right? To impact it, to affect it in a positive light. But the Baal Tshuva represents the type of Jew who their service of God is not sheltered and protected. Rather, they're thrown right into the center of the material world, and from being in the material world, hopes and tries to impact it. So Esau represents the powerful spiritual energy, a spiritual warrior of the Baal Teshuvah. The world needs both of these personalities. The world needs people who are tzaddikim, serene scholars, and the world needs people who are Baal Teshuvahs, who are spiritual warriors, so to speak. This, again, is exactly what took place. Yitzchak wanting to give the blessings, as we talked about last week. Remember, we have Esau's mission in life, and we have Yaakov's mission in life. From the perspective of Yitzchak, he wanted to give the blessings to Esau. Why? Because Esau represented the Baal Teshuvah, the person who engages in the world. He wanted Esau to be the person who was going to develop the material world and transform it to the good. That fit his personality. How did he view Yaakov? Yaakov was the tzaddik. Yaakov was going to develop the spiritual world. Yaakov wanted to give each of his children the blessing that was appropriate for them. However, what was Rivka's perspective? Rivka understood that it's not going to work. Why? Esav was supposed to transform the world, but she knew that was not what was going to happen. Esav would not transform the world, but in fact, Esav himself was transformed by the world. He, in fact, was corrupted by the material world. So what was Rivka's approach? Yaakov needs to get Esav's blessings. It's not going to work any other way. Both approaches are needed. Both approaches have to be adopted by Yaakov. Yaakov, he has to be a master of both worlds. Therefore, he had to get the blessings. So a deception takes place. Yaakov dresses up in the clothes of Esav. He receives the blessing. But even after he receives the blessing, that he is inheriting now also the spiritual approach of Esav, where does his heart lie? What is his true desire? What is Yaakov's natural spiritual orientation, his character and nature in life? What is it? It's to develop the spiritual world. That's who Yaakov is. He was given the mission now to do both the spiritual and material, but that's not who he felt he was on the inside. So after he receives the blessing, the story continues, and he meets Rachel, and he falls in love with Rachel. Why does he fall in love with Rachel? Because Kabbalah teaches us Yaakov is the soulmate of Rachel. Because what is Rachel's spiritual orientation in life? She represents the attitude of a tzaddik. Rachel represents the person who wants to develop the spiritual world, right? Leah, she represents the Baal Tshuva. She's the soulmate of Esav. She represents the passionate spiritual warrior who's able to engage in the material world. So of course, Yaakov is not just attracted to the beauty of Rachel, he's attracted to the spiritual energy that she represents because that's his spiritual energy. That's his natural energy. Naturally, he's not into Leah because Leah represents a totally different type of spiritual energy. Leah represents engagement with the physical, the material, the spiritual warrior. It's not his thing. At this point in time, he has not fully embraced the fact that he is meant to be a master of both worlds and that he has inherited the spiritual destiny of Esav as well. He naturally wants to indulge and engage in spirituality. He falls in love with Rachel. How are we going to get Yaakov to embrace his new role? Right? Yaakov has a mission. He received the blessings. He can't be satisfied only dealing with the spiritual. He cannot be satisfied being married only to Rachel. How do we get Yaakov to embrace his mission? He has to marry Leah also because it's part of his spiritual destiny. He doesn't want to, too bad. He gets tricked into it. There is a deception because ultimately it's part of his spiritual destiny. He has to be both, again, the serene scholar, and he has to be the spiritual warrior. And what follows? The Torah tells us that Leah produces child after child after child, and Rachel passes away. That means Yaakov spends the majority of his life with Leah and with her children. Yaakov spent the majority of his life not as a serene scholar pursuing spirituality, but engaging with the world, dealing with its ups and downs, dealing with all the challenges of life. And you know what? That's the story of our own lives as well. In our own lives, we have to deal with the material. We have to deal with the challenges of life. How much would we desire to be on a almost permanent sabbatical, where there's money in the bank and we can study and we can learn and we can pray and we could develop ourselves? That's not reality. How does life work? We end up spending the majority of our time with Leah and with Leah's children, right? And engaging in the challenges and the obstacles of the material world. But again, where is Yaakov's heart? Yaakov's heart is with Rachel. Who is Yaakov? What is Yaakov's core identity? Yaakov's core identity is as a tzaddik. His first love is Rachel, who also represents the tzaddik. So when Rachel finally gives birth and he has a child, he is hooked. He is absolutely in love. He's dedicated and devoted to his child, the product of his first love, Rachel, Yosef. But he has to remember, Yaakov has another spiritual path as well. There's another spiritual identity. He cannot just be the serene scholar that's dedicated to developing the spiritual world. He has other children. He has another wife that needs attention. He has other children that needs attention. There's another spiritual path that needs attention. And here we have the core of the sibling rivalry. What is the approach and attitude? Is it all about the orientation of being a tzaddik, removing yourself from the material and developing the spiritual world? This is Yaakov, Rachel, Yosef, ultimately Binyamin. Or is it the orientation of Leah and Leah's children, which is no, we have to engage with the world. We have to walk into the heart and the core of the material world. And from there, we have to transform it. This is the rivalry that takes place. The Rebbe says this quite beautifully. Text number 13. Mitchell, would you like to read text number 13, page 118?
Right. The essential difference between the two groups within the tribes of Israel is that the primary focus of the children of Leah is the service of Teshuvah, and the focus of Rachel's children, Joseph and Benjamin, is the service of Tzaddikim. This has its source in their mothers. Leah is connected with the service of the masters of return, and Rachel is connected with the service of the perfectly righteous. This is the meaning of the verse. Rachel was of beautiful form and beautiful appearance. Rachel indicates the service of the perfectly righteous, of beautiful form and beautiful appearance without blemish. Regarding Jacob, it is said, Jacob loved Rachel because, as far as Jacob himself is concerned, his primary task in life is the service of the perfectly righteous. As it says, Jacob was a wholesome man, a dweller of tents. His achievements are the inside, within the realm of holiness, rather than venturing out to elevate the outside of holiness. This is the deeper meaning of what the sages relate that people were saying. Rebecca has 2 sons and Laban has 2 daughters. The elder will marry the elder, and the younger will marry the younger. But his life mission, which is the service of the masters of return, indicates that the task is to return back Esau to goodness, not to Rachel, whose mission is the service of the perfectly righteous.
So now that we understand the inner spiritual dynamics of the sibling rivalry between Yosef and his brothers, and how ultimately that could motivate and lead them to having to choose and having to define what is the mission of the Jewish people, right? The brothers, the mission of the Jewish people is the path of the Baal Tshuva, to be the master of both worlds, to engage in the material. And Yosef represented a threat to what they felt was the central mission of the Jewish people. With this understanding, we now have the ability to understand the second question that we asked, which is, what on earth was Yosef doing to his brothers? See, Yosef got it. Yosef understood after 22 years in Egypt that it's not about one path or the other path. There's not meant to be a winner and there's not meant to be a loser. Both approaches are necessary. Both approaches are required. What Yaakov failed to recognize and to live in his own life, Yosef came to that conclusion, and he needed to bring that, he needed to share that, he needed to demonstrate that in the most concrete way to his brothers. So what did he do? he organized a plan, right? What was his plan? Right. Thank you, Sam, for joining us. We appreciate having you. The recording will be available, so you can watch the rest of it later.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. So Yosef organizes a plan. He says, what happened years ago? Right? He says like this. This is what happened. He says, previously, when my brothers were faced with a challenge, which is the way to serve God? The path of the Baal Tshuva or the path of the tzaddik? They chose to eliminate the path of the tzaddik. They chose to sell Yosef. They came to the conclusion, they came to the determination, the future of the Jewish people is in our approach. It's in our hands. That's the only way that we could fulfill our purpose on earth. So what did Yosef do? He recreated that exact scenario. He made sure that the brothers bring Binyamin down. Who is Binyamin? Binyamin is the second child of Rachel. Binyamin represents the approach to life of the tzaddik. And he forced his brothers to confront themselves. What would they do? Would they allow the second child of Rachel, who represented the approach of the tzaddik, to be sold as a slave again? Would they allow him to be sold down the river, cementing their approach, or not? And what happened? Yehuda fought for Binyamin. Yehuda recognized that both approaches are necessary, the approach of a Baal Tshuva, the approach of a tzaddik, the approach of Leah, the approach of Rachel. So the second time, they defended Binyamin. They both got it, and what happened afterwards, they embraced. All right. Any questions before we continue? I apologize for not asking more often in the class. Anyone have any questions before we continue? Yes, Mitchell.
Yes, but the methodology used against the brothers ultimately traumatizes Benjamin. He's an innocent victim in his own way. He was never part of what happened.
That's a fabulous question, but I will tell you that none of us are innocent victims in life, right? We are all part of a story that preceded us and is going to continue after us. We walk into and we step into a role that essentially originates in those who came before us. So we are all innocent victims, so to speak, but we have to recognize the position that we are forced to be in, and of course, play our role and advance the purpose of creation and advance history along the correct trajectory. Yes, Mark. You got.
Yosef asks his brothers, "Is my father still alive?" Not "Is our father still alive?" Is there meaning to that?
Yes, there are. The meaning in the context here is Yosef is demonstrating to them that even though me and my father have a unique relationship, he has the approach of the tzaddik, I have the approach of the tzaddik, we have this bond. Nevertheless, I reconcile with you. I'm not punishing you, I'm not eliminating you, I'm not angry at you. Absolutely not. I'm reconciling with you because even though I am the approach of the tzaddik, your approach is needed, your approach is valuable, and your approach is critical. So he's demonstrating to them, I'm not giving up my identity and embracing you. Rather, I'm recognizing there's my approach and there's your approach, and we have to work together. So in the story, there is a reconciliation between Yosef and his brothers, but it's not smooth. It's not smooth. After Yaakov passes away, the brothers are worried, the brothers are nervous that perhaps the reunion and the reconciliation was not so complete and so strong. A tension remained, and it's a tension that has remained amongst the Jewish people through all of history. This is a recurring thing. Yosef versus his brothers, more specifically, Yosef versus Yehuda. Where do we see this? Yosef was the leader of the Jewish people in Egypt. right? When the Jewish people enter into the land of Israel, who leads the Jewish people into the land of Israel? Joshua Yehoshua, a descendant of Yosef. Who is the first king of the Jewish people? Shaul, also a descendant of Yosef. Then all of a sudden, this doesn't work out. The Yosef approach to leadership does not continue. The underlying tension reveals itself. Who takes over after Saul? David, who is a descendant of Yehuda. Then it is proclaimed that the dynasty within the Jewish people is going to be from the house of David. So first it's Yosef, then it switches over to Yehuda. When it comes to the dwelling place, the mitzvah to make a dwelling place for God in this world, first we have a Mishkan. There's a tabernacle that travels with the Jewish people for 40 years in the desert, and then for a few hundred years in the land of Israel. However, then we transition over to a permanent location, the Holy Temple. There's the first one for 410 years, there's a second one for 420 years, and we are still waiting for the third temple to descend. The Mishkan was in the town of Shiloh. The Holy Temple was in the city of Jerusalem. The Mishkan was in the territory of Yosef, while the Holy Temple was in the territory of Yehuda. So we see again, there's a tension. There's the Mishkan in the territory of Yosef. There's a Holy Temple in the territory of Yehuda. And finally, another demonstration of this tension, there is a concept called the Mashiach ben Yosef. There is a Messiah, there's a Redeemer that descends from the tribe of Yosef. And then there's Mashiach ben David. There's the Messiah, the ultimate Redeemer that comes from the tribe of Yehuda. So the tension manifests itself over and over again between Yosef and Yehuda, Yosef and his brothers. What is the path and mission and approach to life? Do we engage with the world or do we shy away from the world? This tension exists today, right here and right now. What is the tension? Yosef represents the spiritual life, which represents the approach of tradition. There is an approach to Jewish life where we need to embrace, we need to hold on, we need to place tradition primary. We need to shun the material world. We have to shun the modern world. We have to create insular communities that will not see, that will not hear, that will not be exposed to the modern world. The only way to secure a successful Jewish future, the Yosef model, cling to spiritual life, cling to tradition, wall yourself off from anything external, the insular communal approach. But then there is the approach of Yehuda, right? The approach of the brothers. No, we have to engage in the material world. We have to be part of the modern world. We have to become educated. We have to be professionals. From being within the modern world, then we're going to have the ability to transform the world. We have to recognize that both of these approaches are holy. Both of these approaches have merit. The approach of the original style of Yaakov, of Rachel, of Yosef, that's tradition, spiritual life, in the tense, holiness, that's it. Everything else is irrelevant. And we have the approach of the new Yaakov, who received the blessings of Esav, who marries Leah, who has all of these other children that we have to enter out and go into the world. Both are kosher and both are absolutely needed. So what's the takeaway? What's the message? Why does the story unfold the way that it unfolds? Why is there Esav, then Yaakov? Why is there Yaakov marrying Rachel and then marrying Leah? Why is there a tension with the brothers? What's the takeaway? Right? The message is there is an order. First, there's Yaakov. Then Yaakov receives the blessings of Esav. First, Yaakov marries Rachel, and then he marries Esav. So then he marries Leah, right? How does it work? Another way of saying it is, again, this is critical. Yosef is the path. Yehuda is the goal. What does that mean? We are given a mission by God to enter into the physical, material, secular world, transform it, make it a dwelling place for God, enter a relationship with God. The only way that we can do this is by embracing Yaakov first. Yaakov is the path of spirituality, shunning materialism, embracing ourselves in the spiritual life. It is only through the path of Yaakov that will lead to the path of Esau. It's only through marrying Rachel that we will ultimately be able to impact Leah. It's by becoming Yosef that there ever could be a reconciliation with the brothers. Practically speaking, this means we need to be firmly rooted in our faith and our tradition. Then we can interact in the outside world. Every person has to set times for spiritual serenity, for Torah study, for meditation, for introspection. And you have to venture out into the world and reach out and impact those who are around us. We are Yosef first, but we have to remember that we are his brothers as well.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I'm sorry for being confused, but you're saying that he married Rachel and then he married Leah, but he married Leah first. I'm
Rabbi,
sorry.
He wanted to marry Rachel. Right?
Yes.
His desire, what was his desire? His desire is to marry Rachel. Right? He ended up marrying Leah first. But in terms of what's his desire, what's his focus with Yaakov, he's the spiritual person.
Okay.
Because he's the spiritual person, then he's able to marry Leah and able to have a positive impact in that relationship as well. Does that help, or was that more confusing?
I need to think about it.
So you are correct in the sense that on a practical level, he married Leah first, but his orientation was as Yaakov, right? His focus, his desire, his love, his affection was spirituality, and what was Rachel? That preceded his relationship with Leah. Okay. Similarly, too, he was Yaakov with his own orientation before he got the blessings of Esau. So the bottom line is, when we heal our own inner dichotomy, there's a tension. We're torn towards spirituality. We're torn towards the material. When we fortify and strengthen ourselves spiritually, then we will have the ability to tackle the material world in the most positive and productive sense. When we do that, we heal our inner dichotomy. That brings a healing to the world, which ultimately leads to the coming of Mashiach, and may it happen speedily in our day. And there is a beautiful prophecy that Yosef and Yehuda will once again reunite in the ultimate sense of the word. Now we have the key points video.
Lesson 4, Joseph and his brothers. 1. The story of Joseph and his brothers presents us with two baffling mysteries. A. What led the children of Jacob, who were righteous and holy men, to act in such a way, plotting to kill their own brother and then selling him into slavery? B. Since it's obvious from the narrative that Joseph bore no ill will toward his brothers, what was the purpose of the trials and tribulations to which he subjected them? 2. Both questions are resolved when we understand the deeper roots of the conflict between Joseph and his brothers, a division that runs as a seam throughout Jewish history and exists as a dichotomy within our own lives. 3. There are a number of striking parallels between A. Jacob's deception of Isaac to receive the blessings intended for Esau, B. Jacob being tricked into marrying Leah instead of Rachel, and C. The brothers' selling of Joseph into slavery and misleading their father Jacob into believing that Joseph was killed by a wild animal. Indeed, these three events are interconnected. 4. Although Leah was Jacob's first wife, and the mother of the majority of his children, Jacob regarded Rachel as his primary wife, and Rachel's children as his true progeny, something that the children of Leah refused to accept. This created the divide between the children of Leah and the children of Rachel within the formative family of the people of Israel. 5. On a deeper level, Rachel represents the service of the tzaddik, the development of all that is spiritual and holy in ourselves in the world. Leah represents the service of teshuvah, the mission to engage with the material world in order to transform it and sanctify it. In the original scheme of things, Rachel, the person as well as the lifestyle, was meant to be Jacob's only wife and role, while Leah was destined to marry Esau. However, when Jacob obtained the mastery of the material world by stealing the blessings intended for Esau, he was compelled to marry Leah, as well as to incorporate the service of teshuvah into his life's mission. But his first love remained Rachel and the path of spiritual perfection that Rachel represents. 6. The two paradigms of the children of Rachel and the children of Leah assume various forms. In the earlier periods of Jewish history, the people of Israel were governed by leaders and kings from the tribes of Joseph and Benjamin, i.e., the children of Rachel. Subsequently, however, the leadership of Israel was entrusted to the tribe of Judah, of the children of Leah. The same process is represented in the divine dwellings created by the people of Israel. The portable Mishkan, which was made of organic materials and which stood in the territory of Joseph, represented the service of God through spiritual growth and self-perfection, whereas the Holy Temple, built of stone on its permanent site in the territory of Judah, represented the service of action in the material world. As these examples demonstrate, the Rachel paradigm always precedes and paves the way for the Leah paradigm. 7. The story of the selling of Joseph and the sequence of events leading to Judah risking his life to save Benjamin and to the brothers' reconciliation charts the process by which the children of Leah came to accept the leadership of Joseph. Centuries later, the children of Rachel would be challenged to accept the transition of the nation's leadership to the tribe of Judah. 8. The Talmud presents this dichotomy in the form of a debate. Which is greater, learning or action? The conclusion is that action is the ultimate goal, but one can only reach it through learning. Similarly, the many goals and objectives of Judaism may be described in terms of two general categories. A. Spiritual or religious objectives. B. Improving and perfecting the world. The latter cannot be achieved without the former. In the final analysis, we cannot fix the world without perfecting ourselves.
All right, there's obviously so much that can be discussed on this topic. You may have noticed that in the key points, there were a few points that we did not address in the class because we would be there for so many more hours. So I would highly recommend reading some of the texts that we skipped, as well as the further readings, as well as continuing your learning online at myjli.com/Bible. So I hope that you enjoyed tonight's class and that you will join us, God willing, next week for the next class on Wednesday night.